deserve certainly the most extreme punishment society has, and I think society deserves to be protected from me and from others like me, that's for sure.
Hello, and welcome to True Crime with Cam. This is part 3 of death row inmates and their last words/meals. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, don't worry, the order doesn't matter, but make sure you catch them after this. 19-year-old Michael Lee Wilson and 30-year-old Richard Yost were both working at the Quick Trip convenience store in Tulsa, Oklahoma during the year of 1995. Richard asked authorities to patrol the area more often because he believed that Michael intended on robbing him with some friends. He was right, because a week later on February 26, 1995, Richard began his morning shift at the Quick Trip. At some point, Michael and 3 of his friends entered the store, surrounding Richard. They dragged his body into the back into a cooler. There, they handcuffed the man and bound his ankles before leaving the store to retrieve an aluminum baseball bat. Michael was struck with the bat a total of 54 times over the course of just 2.5 minutes. While removing the store's safe, a security company called to check in. Michael pretended to be Richard and played it off as if everything was fine. He then worked the remainder of the shift in Richard's uniform and name tag, while Richard lay in the cooler, dying in a pool of his own blood. The entire incident was recorded on tape inside the store, which the group stole as well. Michael Lee Wilson, Darwin Brown, Billy Alverson, and Richard Harho were arrested 14 hours later, and the tape of their horrendous crime was recovered. Items in their vehicle made it apparent that the 4 had gone on a shopping spree at the mall right after killing Richard Yost. Michael told investigators that they had planned the murder for weeks. Darwin was executed in 2009, with Billy's execution carrying out just 2 years later. Because Richard was 16 at the time of the murder, he received life in prison without the possibility of parole. On January 9, 2014, Michael ate his last meal before lethal injection: pizza, pomegranate, and a candy bar. His last words were, quote, "I love everybody. Free is free. I'm going home. I'm ready to go. I love you, world. Love my daughters for me. I'm going to miss you, always." As the deadly drug cocktail entered his bloodstream, he stated, "I feel my whole body burning." Richard Yost's widow Angela and their 2 sons witnessed the execution. They were just 2 and 8 years old at the time of their father's murder. Before Michael was put to death, he confessed something that would change the lives of 2 incarcerated men: Malcolm Scott and DeMarco Carpenter. The 2 men had spent 22 years behind bars for a crime they didn't commit. They had exhausted all of their appeals, and probably would have died there had it not been for Michael's confession. In September of 1994, 19-year-old mother Karen Summers was killed in a drive-by outside a house party in Tulsa. Michael was moments from execution when he stated, quote, "Malcolm Scott and DeMarco Carpenter are innocent." Michael Lee Wilson was originally charged as an accessory to the murder, but those charges were eventually dropped, allowing him to carry out the murder of Richard Yost just 5 months later. As for Michael Lee Wilson's final words, he was probably telling the truth when he said his whole body was burning, because one of the 3 usual drugs was replaced with a synthetic one called pentobarbital. According to one woman on the Board of Advocacy and Policy on Criminal Justice for the ACLU, this drug is considered cruel and unusual punishment. She stated, "The use of it is, quote, basically an experiment on human beings. The risk of extended, painful death is very high." Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, to Eleanor Cowell. He never knew his father, and although later on his stepfather treated him like his own child, Ted remained distant. His family settled in Tacoma, Washington, where Ted developed a habit of shoplifting and stealing ski equipment during his high school years. He was antisocial and shy, a loner that couldn't hold down a job for more than a couple months. By his own accounts, Ted would wander neighborhoods at night, digging through garbage for the off chance of finding erotic images, as well as peeking in on women undressing who forgot to shut their curtains. In 1965, Ted went on to study at 2 different universities, ultimately dropping out in 1968. He then became involved in multiple political campaigns, working as a driver, bodyguard, and delegate. After a year-long relationship with a fellow classmate, Bundy was dumped because of his immaturity and lack of ambition. A psychiatrist noted that this was a pivotal time in his development. In 1970, Ted re-enrolled in the University of Washington to study psychology, and the following year landed a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center. A notorious serial killer trying to talk people out of taking their own lives? That's closer to being a Saturday Night Live sketch than the actual truth. But it's confirmed. A co-worker, Anne Rule, would go on to write a highly acclaimed biography about Bundy, titled The Stranger Beside Me. It was during these years that Ted started to come out of his shell and take his future aspirations much more serious. He graduated in '72 and became the assistant of a Washington State Republican Party member. At one point, Ted ironically served on the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. In the fall of '73, he entered law school. However, eventually Ted Bundy's drive and ambition began channeling elsewhere, and he slowly lost interest, subsequently dropping out altogether. All of his energy was now going into kidnapping and killing as many young women and girls as possible. Ted recounted different stories to different people, so there's no way to confirm the truth of when and where he actually started killing. Some detectives believe he started murdering as a teenager. The first confirmed attack occurred on January 4th, 1974. Bundy entered a basement apartment shortly after midnight and came upon 18-year-old Karen Sparks, a dancer and student. He took a metal rod from her bed frame and mercilessly beat her into unconsciousness. With that same rod, or a different object, he caused substantial internal injuries by sexually assaulting her. Karen survived, waking up 10 days later with permanent physical and mental impairments. She believes her life was spared because of her male roommate talking in his sleep, which ultimately spooked Ted from carrying her out and taking her life. Because of her extreme head injury, she was unable to remember who attacked her or any of the horrifying events at all. The first confirmed murder occurred just weeks later, in the early hours of February 1st. Linda Ann Healy was a psychology major and weather reporter for her school's radio station. At 5:30 a.m., A roommate popped her head into Linda's room after noticing her alarm had been going off for an unusually long time. They didn't think anything of it. Maybe she just forgot to turn it off. But their suspicions grew when Linda failed to show up for work and missed a family dinner that evening. Her roommates investigated her room further and found that some of her bedding was gone and that there was blood on her sheets and her nightgown, as well as the basement door being unlocked. Linda's disappearance went unsolved for years until her skull was found on Taylor Mountain in 1975. Bundy placed many remains at this exact location. In '78, Ted admitted that she was his first victim, living just 3 blocks from her at the time. Over the next 4 months, he killed 3 additional students at 3 different colleges. On March 12, 1974, 19-year-old Donna Manson left her dorm room to attend a nearby jazz concert on campus. She never arrived. Bundy confessed to murdering her and burning her skull in a girlfriend's fireplace. The rest of her remains have never been found. 18-year-old Susan Rancourt was abducted and murdered on her college campus a month later. On May 6th of that year, Roberta Parks was lured into Bundy's car and hours later raped, bludgeoned, and strangled to death. Bundy confessed to her murder shortly before his execution. In June, Bundy took the lives of 2 young women, 22-year-old Brenda Ball and 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins. Brenda was last seen in a parking lot after exiting a bar south of Seattle. Georgianne vanished while walking down a campus alleyway. Bundy later confessed to luring her into his car, striking her in the head with a crowbar, and handcuffing her. He drove her 20 miles east, strangled her to death, and spent the night with her corpse. He claimed to have gone back to her body 3 additional times. 23-year-old Janice Ott and 18-year-old Denise Nasland were abducted at the same crowded state park on the same day, just hours apart on July 14th. Ted wandered the crowd in an arm sling and asked young women for help unloading a non-existent sailboat into a nearby lake. Several women denied his requests, except Janice, a probation officer for juveniles. She left the beach with him and never returned. Hours later, Denise, a computer science major, left a picnic and walked to the restroom. 2 months later, her skeletal remains, along with the remains of Janice, were found 2 miles east of the park by local hunters. On October 2nd, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox went out to buy a pack of gum. She never returned, and her body was never recovered. Witnesses last saw her in the passenger seat of a yellow Volkswagen Bug. Bundy later confessed to sexually assaulting her before strangling her to death. He claimed to have buried her body near Capitol National Park. 24 days later, the 17-year-old daughter of a police chief in Salt Lake City was abducted. Melissa Smith had been enjoying an afternoon at a pizza parlor with friends, just before leaving alone. A few days later, her body was found in a park. She had been strangled to death with a nylon sock. Lauren Ann Aim exited a party in the late hours of Halloween night and held out her thumb to catch a ride to a nearby city. Ted pulled up and offered Laura a ride. Bundy was probably ecstatic that Laura willingly got into his vehicle. Unlike other victims, that had to be beaten or held at knife point. Laura was raped, beaten, and strangled to death. Her nude body was found down an embankment in Utah County. The ways in which Ted Bundy would prey on his victims reveals a clear pattern. Ted would target young, white women and girls who were often alone. If they weren't alone, he would use various fallacious stories to lure them into his vehicle. They would either get into the vehicle voluntarily, or he would strike them or threaten them with weapons. Numerous women were fortunate enough to safely reject his attempt, flee, or survive a brutal attack. On November 8th, Carol Durant was approached in a mall parking lot by Ted, who claimed to be a detective. He flashed his fake badge and explained that she needed to come down to the station with him so she could file a police report. A thief had attempted to break into her car. Carol was hesitant at first, but obliged and followed Bundy to his Volkswagen Beetle. This is her own words. He headed down a side street, and then he suddenly pulled over up on the side of a curb by an elementary school, and that's when I just started to freak out. What are we doing? And he grabbed my arm, and he got one handcuff on one wrist, and he didn't get the other one on, and the one was just dangling. I had never been so frightened in my entire life. I knew he was going to kill me. His face and the way he was acting, he was just crazy. He turned into a monster. Bundy attempted but failed to capture her and strike her down with a crowbar. The 18-year-old managed to escape physically unharmed, but has stated she's tried to block the traumatic event from her memory entirely, because you can't live in fear forever. That same evening, disgruntled with his failed attack, Bundy drove to a high school in Bountiful, Utah. In the parking lot, he abducted 17-year-old Deborah Kent. A 3-month search for her body turned up nothing but a human patella bone thought to be hers. The bone was given to the family. The DNA testing at the time could do nothing for them. Belva Kent kept the bones safe in a box for decades. In 2015, authorities asked to test the bone and confirm the remains once and for all. Police confirmed that the bone did in fact belong to Deborah, finally bringing closure to the family in our unsolved case. The estimated number of people Ted Bundy killed is anywhere from 30 to 100. He was a deceitful man that denied killing anyone until shortly before his execution. In 1975, he took the lives of 5 women and girls: 23-year-old Karen Aline Campbell, 26-year-old Julie Cunningham, 25-year-old Denise Oliverson, 15-year-old Susan Curtis, and one of his youngest victims, 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver. The 7th grader disappeared during a lunch break at her middle school on May 5th. Since her disappearance, she's never been recovered. Bundy confessed to drowning her and dumping her body in Snake River. Ted didn't know the name of his victim, but this confession is believed to be about Lynette because Ted knew that the family of the girl had recently moved. This detail is something only the Culver family and close friends would know. However, there is speculation that her murder may be linked to a series of unsolved murders that occurred in Pocatello during the 70s and 80s. Authorities received conflicting statements about Lynette's disappearance that they can't confirm or deny until her body is found or new information is revealed. As for the Culver family, they never stopped searching for their daughter. On August 16, 1975, Ted Bundy was pulled over and arrested for pulling away at the sight of a police cruiser. The officer searched his vehicle and found incriminating items such as a ski mask, pantyhose mask, crowbar, handcuffs, trash bag, rope, ice pick, flashlight, and gloves. They further searched his home and found additional suspicious items. Despite having a collection of items that any stereotypical murderer would possess, Bundy was released because the items couldn't prove that he was a serial killer. He was placed on 24-hour surveillance, and on October 2nd, Carol Durange identified him as the man who attempted to kidnap her while parading as a police officer. His parents were quick to bail him out of jail. When the trial came, Ted was found guilty and sentenced to Utah State Prison. Authorities thought they finally had Bundy under their thumb, but the conniving devil managed to outsmart them once again. After being charged with the murder of Karen Campbell, he was transported to his preliminary hearing and served as his own defense. During a brief recess, he was allowed by the judge to visit the library and research his own case, while free of any handcuffs or restraints. He jumped from a second-story window and fled. Ted was a fugitive for 6 days, until cops pulled him over in a stolen vehicle that had been swerving due to his lack of sleep. He was arrested a third time, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the course of 6 months, Bundy sawed 1 square-foot hole in his prison cell's ceiling. To sneak through it, he dropped 35 pounds, and on December 30th, used a detailed floor plan to crawl his way into the apartment of the chief jailer. He changed into the jailer's clothes and walked out the front door a free man. His escape wasn't discovered for 17 hours. In that time, Bundy managed to go from Aspen, Colorado to Chicago. This second escape would lead him to take the lives of 6 more young women and children. Just weeks after his prison break, he snuck into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. There, he bludgeoned, sexually assaulted, and strangled 21-year-old Margaret Bowman and 20-year-old Lisa Levy. 20-year-old Kathy Kleiner and 22-year-old Karen Chandler were severely injured, but survived the attack because the headlights of a car shined into their window, scaring Bundy away. On the same night, less than 6 blocks away, Cheryl Thomas was found in a pool of blood. The FSU dance major had suffered severe head injuries and was taken to the hospital in a coma. Cheryl eventually woke from her coma, permanently deaf in one ear, with multiple skull fractures, a broken jaw, and a dislocated shoulder. On February 8th, he attempted to kidnap 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of a chief detective for Jacksonville Police. He identified himself as a firefighter, but when her older brother arrived and challenged Bundy's identity, he walked away. The next morning, he drove to Lake City Junior High to abduct and murder his youngest victim. 12-year-old Kimberly Leach left her homeroom class to get a purse from the lost and found, never returning. A firefighter driving by had seen a man gripping her arm, walking her to a white van in the middle of the street. He thought he was her father. Kimberly's body was found 7 weeks later in a pig shed 35 miles away. She had been raped and her neck cut. It's believed that this is the last victim of Ted Bundy. On February 12th, his reign of murderous terror would end after being pulled over by police near the Alabama state line. After checking the license plate, the officer was notified that the vehicle had been stolen. Bundy fled the scene on foot, but was tackled by the officer after a short chase. He was unaware at that point that he had just taken down one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Ted stated, "I wish you had killed me." Ted's trial was the first to be televised nationwide across the US. Bundy refused a plea deal that would have taken the death penalty off the table because of his own pride. He didn't want to tell the world he was guilty. However, the evidence against him spoke for himself. And on July 24th, 1979, he was found guilty for the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, the attempted murder of their sorority sisters, and 2 counts of burglary. During his Florida trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach, he legally married Carol Ann Boone after calling her to the witness stand, because there's some odd Florida law that allows one to do that. Carol Ann would eventually give birth to their daughter in October of 1980, citing Bundy as the father. Ted Bundy was sentenced to death 3 times. On death row, he finally began revealing details about the crimes and his thoughts to investigators. Bundy said that he would often return to some victims several times after their deaths to perform sexual acts on their decomposing bodies. Approximately 12 of his victims were decapitated. One investigator on the case said, quote, "He is just totally consumed with murder all the time." His defense attorney, Polly Nelson, wrote, "It was the absolute misogyny of his crimes that stunned me. His manifest rage against women. He had no compassion at all. He was totally engrossed in the details. His murders were his life's accomplishments." On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair. He didn't eat a bite of his final meal, the default prison food served to every inmate. His final words were simply, quote, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." It was directed at his lawyer and priest. A criminology professor would later state, "I think Ted wanted to keep up this image that he had a family that loved him, that he had friends that cared for him. I think he wanted to portray the image, even to the very end, that he was beloved." Bundy died with a creepy grin on his face. One witness said, quote, "I think it was Ted's way of saying, in the end, I still won." On the evening of June 21st, 2000, Christina Neal went with her older sister Victoria to a friend's home down the street. Just outside the home, the 2 girls got into an argument. It's not clear what the argument was about. Victoria, who was just 16 at the time, walked towards the home to cool down for a few minutes. Christina was left standing with her friend's brother. When she returned to the spot, she was informed that her 12-year-old sister was angry and had left as well. Victoria went back to their house down the street, but Christina wasn't there either. Victoria went to sleep that night unaware of her little sister's whereabouts. When their father, Victor, woke up for work, he assumed that Christina was asleep in bed because the girl's bedroom door was closed. When Victor came home from work around 4 in the afternoon, his daughters Victoria and Jennifer stated that Christina had never returned home. Victor assumed that she was still at the friend's house they had been at the day before, so he asked them to go get her. However, Christina still wasn't there. She hadn't come back at all since the argument. Victoria, Jennifer, and their father began searching for Christina until 11 p.m. that night, hoping that she had just spent the night at another friend's house. As the group was walking along the road near the home, they found Christina's glasses. They were broken and smashed. According to the Neal family, this wasn't out of character for the 12-year-old. She was known to get angry, smash her glasses, and run off. This, unfortunately, led them to continue searching for Christina for another day on their own, before finally reporting her disappearance to police. The FBI didn't join the investigation until the 26th, 5 days after she vanished. That same day, Jennifer and her mother found a pink pair of underwear at the edge of the woods, across the street from the Neal home. Deeper into the woods, along a pathway, Victoria found Christina's bracelet and a necklace around the same time. On June 28th, investigators questioned Jonathan Green, a man who lived down the street from the Neal family. Jonathan claimed he didn't know anything about Christina's whereabouts and that he had been home or at a neighbor's house at the time of her disappearance. He gave permission to the officers to search his home, who found nothing out of the ordinary, and left. A month went by until significant clues came about. Manuel Jimenez, who lived in the home behind Jonathan's, told investigators that Jonathan had an unusually large fire in his burn pile the day after Christina disappeared. At this time, Manuel was in a relationship with Victoria Neal, and his niece was friends with Christina. Christina was last seen leaving Manuel's residence, which borders the property of Jonathan Green. Investigators went back to Jonathan's home and requested to search the property, and again, Jonathan allowed them to do so, as long as he could be present. One of the FBI agents prodded at the burn pile with a metal probe to check the soil for any disturbances. The probe sank 4 feet into the ground. The agents also began to notice the distinct smell of, quote, some sort of decaying body. When the investigators started to dig at the burn pile, Jonathan became angry and told them to leave. When asked what he had buried, Jonathan claimed he had buried a bulldog there, but threw it into the woods 2 years ago. Because the agents didn't have a search warrant, they had to comply. They returned with a warrant just hours later. The burn pile had been dug up, leaving a shallow, empty grave in its place. Jonathan told investigators he excavated it only to show that, quote, there was no dead body in there. A cadaver dog was brought onto the scene and alerted in the direction of the house. The dog repeatedly returned to the side of a recliner that was wedged in the corner of Jonathan's living room. One of the agents finally peered behind the recliner, and poking out of a blue laundry bag was the charred foot of 12-year-old Christina Neal. Before the discovery was even announced to the other officers, Jonathan muttered, quote, those Mexicans are setting me up. Put a body in my house. A medical examiner concluded that Christina's cause of death was strangulation, citing a ligature mark around her neck. She had been bound, gagged, and sexually assaulted before she was murdered. Hairs and fibers recovered from her body matched that of Jonathan and his property. The medical examiner further concluded that it would be impossible for the hairs found on her body to be placed there after she was wrapped in a blanket and laundry bag. Additionally, the carpet fibers found on her underwear were identical to the carpet in Jonathan's home. He was immediately arrested for Christina's murder, but claimed up until his very end someone else had killed the child and planted her body there. If all that evidence wasn't enough to convince a jury that Jonathan Green was the murderer, his violent past would have sealed the deal. During his trial, a woman named Micah testified about the rape she endured 4 years prior. As she was walking down a dirt road late one night, Jonathan dragged her to his property, pulled her down, and began to choke her. He then forced her to vomit by shoving his fingers down her throat, stating that he would kill her and break her neck if she screamed. Micah escaped after the rape, but never reported the event to police because of her outstanding warrant. In July of 1999, Jonathan Green entered the neighboring home of Yossi Jimenez and Manuel and demanded that Yossi have sex with him. After Yossi was raped, she called police and was taken to the hospital. She didn't show up for the court date because she was afraid to face her attacker. Jonathan reportedly attempted to rape her again, but Yossi was armed with a pocket knife and was able to scare him off. Another violent and disturbing crime linked to Jonathan Green was the murder of a woman's pony. In January of 2000, the pony was stolen from a pasture and found deceased a month later in a wooded area near Jonathan's home. The pony had been stabbed to death, and lying next to its body was a pair of shears and a broken butcher knife. Jonathan was questioned and admitted that the shears belonged to him, but claimed that they had been stolen weeks ago. The only print found on the shears was a match to Jonathan's middle finger. While awaiting the conclusion of his trial in the Montgomery County Jail, there were 5 separate occasions in which he assaulted or threatened the lives of officers and inmates. Jonathan Green was found guilty of capital murder in July of 2002, with the jury sentencing him to death. His attorney continued to fight for appeals and stays of execution on the basis that Jonathan wasn't mentally fit to be executed. The psychiatrists who examined Green had very different opinions on his mental state. For the defense, his examination concluded that Jonathan was schizophrenic, with a firm delusional belief that he did not and could not have killed Christina Neal. Jonathan told his attorney that he had hallucinations of ongoing spiritual warfare between 2 sets of voices representing good and evil. At the same hearing, the state psychiatrist found his thoughts and behaviors to be well organized. During the examination, Green also complained about the false evidence at trial and how the state would put him on a table and give him an injection, killing him. The last attempt to save his life was made on the day of his execution. On October 12, 2012, his case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. After a delay of 5 hours, his stay of execution was lifted. Texas no longer offers a last meal to death row inmates, so the 44-year-old was given typical prison food. While strapped to the gurney, the warden asked Jonathan if he had any last words. He responded, "No." Seconds later stating, quote, "I'm an innocent man. I did not kill anyone. Y'all are killing an innocent man." As the drugs began to course through his veins, he said, "My left arm is killing me. It hurts bad." Thank you so much for listening to this episode. My next episode is going to be about the recent tragedy that took place at Astroworld in Houston, Texas. I'm going to compile everything we know so far and try my best to make sure that it's as accurate as possible. I've seen an insane amount of misinformation and conspiracy theories circulating that aren't doing anyone any good. I want to compile all the evidence of how this could have been prevented so many times, and how Travis Scott and everyone involved that had authority over that situation need to be held accountable, no matter how much money they have. If you're listening on YouTube, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment for any kind of true crime case you want me to cover next. Have a good day, evening, or night. Goodbye.